Hello and welcome to this lecture on liberalism and specifically liberal attitudes towards the economy. Now, to begin with, it's important to note that the belief in private property and a market-based economy is a fundamental belief shared by all liberals. The differences emerge, however, between classical liberals and modern liberals on the degree to which state involvement in the economy is acceptable or desirable. So in this lecture, I'm going to look at four key thinkers within the liberal tradition: John Locke, Adam Smith, J.S. Mill, and T.H. Green, and give a very brief summary of their views and attitudes towards the economy. So first of all, classical liberals such as John Locke identified two basic spheres within the life of society, within social life: the public sphere and the private sphere. Now, the public sphere consists of those areas in which governments are considered to have a right to legislate and regulate matters, for example, such as defense, law and order, and so on. The private sphere then comprises those matters which the state is deemed to have no right to legislate in or regulate or interfere in, if you like. Matters which are the purely private affair of individual citizens in the eyes of liberals. So we're talking about things such as political belief, religious belief, reading habits, lifestyle choices, and so on. And in these areas, for liberals, the state is deemed to have no right to interfere, and individuals should be at liberty to act as they see fit. For classical liberals such as John Locke, economic affairs lie entirely within the private sphere. That is to say, they should be regarded as the purely private concern of individuals and not a matter for state legislation or regulation. Now, for Locke, the state's role should be strictly limited to, in terms of the economy, strictly limited to, on the one hand, the protection of private property, and on the other, the upholding of freely negotiated contracts. This requires a system of criminal law and courts in the first case, and civil courts in the second. Anything beyond this, for example, any attempt by the state to redistribute wealth from rich to poor, or to promote public services, were viewed as an unwarranted intrusion by the state into the private sphere. So for Locke, the only legitimate role for government was to uphold the three natural rights of its citizens: the right to life, to liberty, and to property. Taxation, therefore, which is a breach of property rights, effectively, was only ever justified in order to fund those state functions necessary for upholding those three rights. So, for example, defense forces would be a legitimate use of taxation because it would be necessary to defend against invasion and thus protect the right to life. A system of law enforcement, prisons, courts, and so on, would be necessary to uphold liberty and property by punishing those who would violate either of them, and a civil court system to uphold freely negotiated contracts and thus uphold property rights. These things would be justified, but taxing citizens for any purposes beyond these were viewed by classical liberals such as Locke as a breach of fundamental property rights, because they involve taxing people, which is taking away some of their property. Furthermore, the classical liberals believed strongly in the ideal of self-reliance, which you can also think of as possessive individualism, which means that each individual was responsible for himself and responsible to no one but himself. So no one had a duty to look after anyone else, and no one had the right to seek support from anyone else, least of all from the state. Everyone should look after themselves. So, summing up, systems of state support for people or redistributing wealth or anything like that were seen as morally wrong by classical liberals such as Locke on two counts. Number one, the tax required to fund them would be a breach of the property rights of the taxpayer. And number two, the capacity for self-reliance of those in receipt of such support would be radically undermined. Now, this basic belief was largely supported by the classical liberal economist Adam Smith, who was writing it around about 100 years after Locke. His book, The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776, a big year for liberalism, as it marked also the beginning of the War of American Independence, which was heavily influenced by liberal ideals. And to these two moral arguments, against state intervention, Smith also added an economic argument for unregulated free market, what we would today call free market capitalism. Smith put forward the belief that the free market was almost a kind of miraculous system, because what it did is to harness people's innate selfishness. Remember that liberals believe people's human nature is to be self-interested. So the free market would harness people's innate selfishness to positive ends which serve the common good. So it's a way of kind of transforming something that is potentially negative, self-interest and selfishness, to something that is actually beneficial to society at large. This belief is illustrated very clearly by his famous and simple quote. He said, "It's not from the benevolence," that is the kind of innate goodness, "it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." So essentially, in a free market economy, what he's saying is the desire to make profit incentivizes people to be as productive as possible, which is good for society as a whole. Furthermore, subjected to the pressures of competition, each individual enterprise is compelled to produce goods of a high quality or of a low cost, or preferably both, or else risk losing out to their competitors. And this is because, again, the rational self-interest of the consumer this time would naturally lead them to prefer the better and cheaper products. So the free market, then, Smith argued, naturally roots out the least efficient and promotes the most efficient enterprises. And this is a net benefit, a net gain for society at large. And this process has become known as the hidden hand of the market, the way that markets do this. That they kind of promote an overall efficiency through free markets and competition. Smith, in fact, believed that the hidden hand that he identified would tend to equalize living conditions across society in the long run, and this was actually one of his reasons for supporting the free market. J.S. Mill, however, writing in the following century, the mid-19th century, could see that things hadn't exactly panned out that way. They hadn't panned out exactly as his classical liberal forebears had expected. So he lived through an era of massive industrialization and urbanization, but that process had not led to an improvement in living conditions for all. In fact, it had concentrated wealth in fewer and fewer hands, whilst leading to the rise of disease-ridden slums for the working masses. So in other words, it massively exacerbated inequality. And Mill is interesting as he falls both chronologically and ideologically somewhere in between classical and modern liberalism. He started out as a classical liberal, a supporter of the minimal state advocated by Locke, but later modified his views to take into account the need to alleviate the grinding poverty which he witnessed around him. Now, one of Mill's basic principles was what became known as the harm principle. This is the idea that the state has no right to interfere in anyone's actions unless they were harmful to others. Another way of thinking of this is that people should have the right to do anything they want unless it's harmful to others. Sometimes expressed in the simple formula, this is not a quote from Mill, but it's a useful way of thinking about what he's saying. Your freedom to swing your arms ends where my nose begins. In other words, people should be at liberty to do as they please, as they see fit, so long as it does not conflict with the liberty of others, does not harm other people. Now, his initial version of the harm principle ruled out state involvement in the economy, but just as Locke had done. But he later revised that position and came to accept the need for state intervention to alleviate poverty, for example, through what he promoted was an inheritance tax, a tax on inherited wealth, and the provision of free state education. He even later in life adopted almost socialistic positions, such as advocating the abolition of wage labor in its entirety in favor of a system of worker-owned cooperatives. So that's J.S. Mill. T.H. Green, writing a couple of decades after Mill, in the 1870s, provided a more systematic philosophical justification for state regulation of the economy. Like all liberals, he supported a largely privately owned free market economy. But unlike the classical liberals, he departed from the concept of a minimal state in favor of what he called an enabling state. Now, Green believed that true freedom, what Isaiah Berlin later termed positive freedom, meant more than simply freedom from state coercion. He believed that to be truly free meant being free to fully develop one's talents, unique talents and capacities in order to fully flourish as an individual. And Green saw that the state was not the only potential obstacle to this kind of self-development that he promoted. Poverty, ill health, illiteracy were also preventing people, millions of people in his time, from truly flourishing as individuals and developing to the full their capacities and unique talents as individuals. So if the state's role is to facilitate individual freedom, then, argued Green, it needed to take steps to remove these obstacles. Thus, Green provided a liberal philosophical justification for state intervention in the economy. To be fully free meant to be free from poverty, ill health, and illiteracy, and thus required things like, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you do something here? Why don't you pause the video and think about what kind of state intervention in the economy would be required if you accepted there was a need for the state to tackle poverty, ill health, and illiteracy. Pause the video a second and see what you come up with. So, yeah, so he supported measures such as the regulation of working hours and conditions, the provision of free education, at least at primary level, and so on. And this is what Green meant by an enabling state, as opposed to a minimal state. A state that enabled people to fully develop their individual talents and capacities in order to fully flourish as individuals. Modern liberals after Green, especially in the 20th century, came to develop these ideas even further to support much greater state provisions than Green himself had proposed, with social liberals such as Keynes advocating a fully fledged welfare state, for example. So, to conclude, all liberals believe in this distinction between a public sphere and a private sphere, and all believe that economic matters fall largely within the realm of the private sphere. The difference is that classical liberals believe that economic affairs belong entirely in the private sphere, whereas modern liberals believe that some state intervention in the economy is justified. In other words, whilst classical liberals believe in a minimal state in which the economic and political spheres are kept entirely separate, modern liberals support an enabling state in which the state has a role in alleviating poverty, illiteracy, and ill health through regulation and the provision of public services. All liberals, though, believe in an economy based primarily on private property and the free market, and it's this that distinguishes even the most radical of modern liberals from fully fledged socialism. Thank you. I hope this was useful to you.